So now to the session. I'll just introduce our host for the session, Laura Kings. Laura is an experienced teacher with a background in English, media studies and religious education. She's our assistant editor for Education and Youth at Australian Catholics Magazine and has a keen interest in creating quality teacher resources and engaging students, and is also an experienced journalist who's worked in radio and print. The area of literacy is one of Laura's big passions and strengths, and so this session is one that she's really excited about. So I might just hand it over to Laura, and she can then introduce our other guests.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yes, I was fangirling to our guests just just before we came on, because I am a bit excited about this one. This is a real teaching as well as a real theology session all in one. So I'm really enjoying it. So we're really blessed today to be joined by two fantastic experts in their field. First, we're joined with Rauno Parrila, who is actually the director of the Australian Centre for the Advancement of Literacy at ACU. Dr. Parrila's research focuses on psychological, linguistic and social correlates of both typical and atypical development of reading skills. He has a keen interest in reading instruction and interventions, reading difficulties in different orthographies and compensation of learning difficulties in both children and adults. So some very useful areas of expertise there. We're also joined by Janine Luttick, who's a lecturer in biblical studies in the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy at ACU. She began teaching after completing her PhD in 2018. Janine has published in the areas of the Gospel of Mark and contemporary biblical hermeneutics. Her current research focuses on the depiction of female children in the Bible, connecting her study with scholarship on the history of emotions and on family studies in the New Testament. Janine is currently preparing a contribution to a volume on global perspectives of reimagining family and household in the New Testament. So some more meaty stuff there. And also, I think talking about female children is probably close to our heart as teachers as well. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Later in the session, I probably rushed in 5 minutes at the end. I've taken to doing a little teaching demonstration so that you all get to take something home that you can try out in the classroom. And I was thinking about, as busy teachers, we're always asked to do a lot of things. How can we make it faster and easier? So I've been testing ChatGPT to see how we can use it to reliably generate some classroom materials when you're in a rush, because a lot of us we're in the position where our preparation time and our marking time are the same time, so we need to use it effectively. So but the problem with ChatGPT is it's not always reliable. So I figured out how to make it a bit more a bit more reliable when you're using it, and it comes down to what source you're using. So without wasting any more time, we obviously have two experts who are slightly, whilst literacy links everything, have slightly different backgrounds. So I'm actually going to speak to Rauno first, and then I'm going to have a chat to Janine about how we can translate this and how we can use it when we're reading the Bible with students. So I'll turn to you first, Rauno. Can you share some insights from your research on effective reading instruction and interventions, just to get us started?
Sure. Let me just share some insight of ChatGPT, because when you ask me to give you a short bio, I asked ChatGPT to write my bio, and I could not recognize myself from that bio. It assigned research to me that I've never done, and told that I'm expert on issues that I know very little about. So I thought that there might be somebody else with my name, but my name is pretty unique. So that was sort of my first foray on ChatGPT. So be careful with it. Don't trust the facts that come out. Double check that they are okay. And I also noticed that if I ask the same question twice, I get a different answer, which was quite interesting. The second one was a little bit better than the first one. So I guess it learned that I wasn't happy with. I wouldn't ask a second time if I was happy with the first answer. So maybe if I'd continued asking the same question 5, 6, 7 times, I would have gotten an answer that I'm happy with. Who knows? In terms of reading, well, if you are in a school nowadays, you're learning that you have to move towards structured approach to literary language and a more explicit direct teaching than what you probably were trained to do when you were in your teacher education program. So that is the biggest change that has been happening. It's actually been happening all over the world for more than 30 years now, ever since 1980s, where we have learned that to learn to read, you learn to read better when you break the language apart. And the more different ways you have to break the language apart, the better reader you tend to be. So we now emphasize phonemes, we emphasize graphemes, we emphasize etymology of the words, we emphasize morphemes. So if you have a representation of a word that is rich in a sense that it's redundant in the sense that you can break that word apart into the graphemes it's made of, the sounds it's made of, the morphemes it's made of, it's much more easier for you to access that word. And the bigger the word is, the more important that is. So when you go into areas like history or religious studies, where some of the words are really long, you need to be able to break them into meaningful chunks so that you can then also use those same chunks with other words. So that's one thing that has been happening. There is no such thing as learning words as whole that is effective, which is very, very different from spoken language learning. In terms of interventions, what we have learned is that if we do this structured approach to early reading instruction very effectively, we shouldn't have more than 3 to 5% of children who struggle with learning to read words. Typically in the school systems right now, we have something between 15 and 25% of children who struggle. But a lot of those are, we think that they are, some of them are in instructional casualties. So the instruction hasn't met their needs. The others could be instructional casualties or sort of resource casualties in the sense that they don't need a different kind of instruction. They need more intensity in that instruction. But that intensity is not available because of schools not having a sufficient number of teachers, classrooms being too big, and all that sort of things in there. But what we are learning from longitudinal studies, quite large longitudinal studies that we've been running in Canada now, is that we can get that number of struggling readers to about 4%, somewhere around 4 and 5%. Now, those readers are still able to learn, but they are the ones that might need support all the way through their school career. So whenever there is a new learning task, they need extra support with that new learning task. Now, I've also studied some of those sort of persistently poor readers as university students. We have a significant number of quite poor readers that are attending universities. And we also have dyslexics, severe dyslexics who have Nobel Prizes. So you have to always remember that even if they are poor readers and you need to work with them, that is no reason whatsoever to lower the expectations of their academic outcomes. They may be the next Australian Nobel Prize winner if they choose their careers correctly. They might not be the best historian, for example, because historians need to read massive amounts of texts. And typically persistently poor readers, even if they learn to read accurately, they remain slow in reading. So they may need to choose other topics that they get interested in. So those are some of the insights that we have right now. We haven't yet figured out how do we make everybody a good reader. So the vision that we have for the center is that everybody should get the kind of reading skills they need to pursue their dreams. Our vision is not to make everybody a good reader. We cannot reach that right now or in the foreseeable future. But we don't all need to be good readers. But we all need to have some literacy skills. There are very, very few jobs left that don't require some literacy skills. We used to think that the resource industry tradies, that they didn't need a whole lot of literacy skills, but that's not true any longer. A tradie who wants to install a new hot water heater will have to read through a relatively complex manual on how that heater works and how it needs to be installed safely. So there are very, very few jobs any longer that are left for functionally illiterate individuals. And there's no reason why Australian schools would produce anybody who doesn't have functional literacy skills. That's totally achievable goal for all of us. We've studied this with a lot of work with primary school teachers, and the goal is to expand it to high school teachers in about 3 to 4 years' time.
That sounds excellent. I can't wait to see it expanded into high school teachers as well, because I think sometimes the high school teachers get overlooked. Everybody assumes the kids have been taught.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, there are a lot of high school students who are reading somewhere around year 3, year 4, year 5 level and can't access the high school curriculum properly. And now a lot of high schools have now started also to hire primary teachers to work with these individuals that are better trained in how to remediate their reading. But you also have the additional problem, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, which is the disciplinary reading skills. So reading a history text is not the same as reading a novel. Reading a science text is not the same as reading any English text. So your English teacher is not the right teacher to teach you how to read a history text, how to read a math text, how to read a science text. That's actually discipline-specific literacy skills that the teacher who teaches science is the best teacher of reading, how to read science. However, often they aren't taught themselves what the common structure of those texts are, how the arguments are built, and where to find the information when you need to find it quicker. So in a sense, what we hope to do is not to make all teachers reading teachers, but make all teachers understand the reading requirements of the text that they are asking children to read. Because they are experts on those texts, it's not necessary, they don't necessarily any longer, they might not be able to explicate how they do it because it's automatic for them. So you kind of like need to unbuild that skill, and so that, okay, well, this is where you started, then you learned this and this and this, and when you can do that with the texts, the children's ability to access curriculum can improve quite a bit.
Excellent. That's precisely why we brought Janine in today to speak as well, to speak on, because there is one particular book that has to be read in a certain way that we're all familiar with in the RE classroom. Yeah, so much to unpack there, Rauno. And if we don't get to that point about subject specific, and cover it enough, we'll jump back to it. But So we're talking a lot about structural practices today. Are there any particular practices that you endorse that teachers can go away and find out more about after this session?
Yes, so if you're working with very young kids, then we absolutely endorse phonics. There is no way around phonics. It is really important for children to learn to spell properly, and it's really important for them to learn to read new words that they've never seen properly. And you may think that, okay, well, phonics, it's just an early reading skills, but it's a super important skill when you start to read more complex science texts, for example, because most of those words that you see there are either Greek or Latin based, and they are almost always fully transparent. So they are autocorrect. If you sound them out, you pronounce them correctly, which is not true for many of the smaller common words. So in a sense, your phonics skills become really important in high school when you are learning new skills, but then when you're learning new vocabulary. But then what the other important thing that we emphasize is morphology. And you need to learn to take the words apart. And this is again very important in science, for example, because the same bases or roots are used in multiple different words. And once you learn, when you learn to take photosynthesis apart, you know what photo is, you know what synthesis is. You run into them in multiple different combinations in other places. And when you see that word again, a word using that base again, you are halfway through the figuring out what does it mean. So you have these sort of transferable skills of learning, figuring out new words. You don't need a dictionary as frequently if you understand the morphology of those words. And of course, etymology is interesting from the spelling point of view, because why English words are spelled as wildly as they are often spelled has a lot to do with what language were they taken from. And if you understand a little bit about that history and etymology, your spelling will improve quite a bit.
And I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, and Janine might be able to confirm this. I suppose we're in RE, we're often dealing with Greek roots or Latin, or and in terms of etymology, I mean, I know there's lots of biblical research into the correct way to interpret the ancient Hebrew language as well. So, and it can be really fascinating when you read it. But I'm just trying to think, Janine, whether I'm on track or off track there. There might be some ways you can translate that from science into RE.
It's a whole science in itself. So we've also got Aramaic, we've got Hebrew, we've got different forms of Hebrew. In the New Testament, we've got what they call Koine Greek, which is communal Greek, local Greek, but you've also got classical Greek, which is different, and there's Aramaic, and there's very big debates around what it means to translate that into English. So, which I don't think is really the concern of people in schools, but there's a lot of debate because you're dealing with texts that are written in a very different context. Therefore, what that word may have meant in its ancient context, and then understanding that and then trying to translate that into a way that's accessible to an English speaker, for example, or whatever language you're translating into, there's multiple issues there. It's complex.
I think what I've come across with doing the teacher's notes is that things that I've learned in the past have had more research done into them, and the translation has changed, and there's just been a slight difference in the understanding of the translation, even from being a cradle Catholic, you know, how I understood it as a kid to now, or how I taught it when I first went into the classroom, then all of a sudden I've read something now, you know. I think that's probably where it comes up for teachers. It's like, I always thought it meant this, and then you look at some, you know, good quality sources and find out you were wrong. Anyway, we'll jump back to Rauno. So when we're talking about the structural approach to teaching literacy in the classroom, is it the only way?
Well, I think I would not earn my salary if I would argue that there's only one way of teaching. That just simply doesn't make any sense. But when we are talking about structure of language and we're talking about learning about different ways of breaking language apart, that tends to sort of be translated into, it's interesting that you mentioned how words mean something different now. So a lot of us have been, when we were younger, we were exposed to explicit teaching that was extremely boring rote learning. Well, that's not what explicit instruction any longer is. Explicit instruction, when it's done properly, can be super interactive. And you start with those bits and pieces, you build entities out of them, and then you learn the skills to do the inquiry with those entities. So you go from explicit instruction of the skills and information needed to do the inquiry properly, rather than that you ask the children to do the inquiry when they don't have the skills to do it. So no, it's not the only way of teaching it, but it is the building blocks that you use to get to the level where you can then do something different and you can do something creative. One of the analogies I like to use is artists. So when someone does a beautiful painting, they have enormous amount of technical detail skills that they have that have nothing to do with that you cannot necessarily even see in the end result. But unless they have that technical skill, the end result would never have surfaced. And the same is in a sense true in reading, that when you are a really good adult reader, the skill sets that you need to use them are hidden. You don't have access to it. You look at the words, you automatically recognize those words. You don't know what you no longer have access to what your brain actually did. Your brain processed every single letter. When you read text, your brain processes every single letter of every single word. But you don't know that. That's so automatic that it's all hidden. Once you do that, and you are automatic, then you have the skill set to do whatever you want with that. So you can now become creative. You also, the more you read, you also tend to be a better writer. So there's a very strong correlation between good reading skills and good writing skills. But there's also a correlation between reading a lot of different kinds of materials to become a good writer. So no, the structural approach to language is the beginning. It's not the end. The end is to use the language to achieve whatever else you want to achieve, both in reading and writing.
Nice solid base. And how can teachers, so let's talk about subject-specific vocabulary and knowledge. Now, I've picked this up out of the Grattan Institute report that was released earlier this year. And is there a way, so that's trendy at the moment, is there a way we can incorporate that into our teaching, and how do we do that? What is it? How do we do it?
Yeah, you absolutely have to do it. So when I went to my training, and I'm trained as a developmental psychology, but also as a special education. And when I went through my training, we were always taught to activate background knowledge. So when children were supposed to read text, we would ask them some questions about that text, thinking that we activate their background knowledge, and then we would start going through the reading. That doesn't work. What you end up activating is typically incorrect background knowledge or misconceptions about that background. What you actually need to do is to look at the text ahead of time, identify the words that you need to pre-teach to the children, or explain before they read that, because otherwise they get stuck with those words and don't process the entity, don't process the meaning. And that's what you do. That's how you get to that. That's where that suggestion of disciplinary vocabulary teaching comes from. You teach the words that are going to be difficult for them before you ask them to read. Now, that's more work for you, of course, as a teacher, because you now need to read all the text beforehand, and you need to decide that, okay, what are the words that they are going to struggle with, but also what are the ideas that they're going to struggle with. And then you preach that. That's the background knowledge. Don't activate the incorrect, partial, or misleading background knowledge. Teach the vocabulary and the background knowledge they need to understand that text. And then the children will learn that text.
That is, to me, obviously I was in the generation of teachers who got taught to activate their background knowledge, and that's just revolutionary. Everybody, I'll be changing the teacher notes to reflect that.
It's an easy, it's not a difficult change to do. It's just, you just need to stop and think that, okay, what am I activating here? Is it, do these children, now let's take that back. If you think that the children actually have the right background knowledge and that you can activate it, then what you do is retrieval practice. You ask very targeted questions that the children, when they answer it correctly, everybody in the classroom hears the right background knowledge. You don't, again, ask them to think about something. You ask very targeted questions. And the answers to those questions then guide the whole class to the right kind of a background knowledge that will help them to understand. So it's just you're essentially going to the same thing, but you're going for it much more targeted, explicit manner that will get you there for sure. Whereas let's think about this as open-ended questions don't get you there.
So I was at a writers' festival earlier this year, and they talked about nuggets of gold. Everybody, that is a nugget of gold. If you're taking notes, write it down right now, because you know, depending on your age and how long it's since you did your teaching degree, that could be a good one for you. It certainly was for me. And what strategies do you recommend for addressing reading difficulties for students, particularly in subjects like RE, with subject-specific vocabulary and concepts, or where those students aren't necessarily learning their primary reading skills?
Mm-hmm. Well, the model that is now being implemented in quite a few Australian schools is the multi-tiered system of support. And in many ways, the multi-tiered system of support approach should work in any topic area that it's not a specific to English or anything else. So in multi-tiered system of support, you have your regular explicit instruction, but you also then relatively early identify the children, and you probably know already who are the children that will struggle learning that content. So then you build within your normal instructional block, you build a repetition, a retrieval practice for those children while other children are doing something else. So they may be doing an independent reading or extension or writing or something like that. But you have your group that you know may not have learned the main content from the earlier, and you do a second essentially you do a second teaching session with them, except that you structure it so that it becomes a retrieval practice. You don't just teach, you ask them. You ask them to try to retrieve it. And any little bit they retrieve, every time they are asked to retrieve something, any little bit they retrieve becomes more accessible next time. So there's nothing better than asking questions, which you all as teachers are good at doing anyways. But you need to ask very targeted questions, and then you give hints, and then you give more hints so that they get to the answers. And if they are, like, for example, in early literacy instruction, we recommend that let's say you're teaching 2 grapheme phoneme correspondences in the morning, and you know the children that are going to struggle with learning those new grapheme phoneme correspondences. You do a retrieval practice them during the same block, but then you do another one towards the end of the day. and then you possibly send something very simple home. You don't ask the parents to teach them, because many parents don't know how to do that. But you can send them a simple sheet of paper home that allows the child to show the parents that, what did I learn today? And now these are the new words that I can read with that information. So they actually get then a fourth retrieval practice at home. And all the parents have to do is spend 5 minutes of listening to their child, trying to read through a couple of words, and then put a tick mark on the paper that, yes, we did this at home.
That's
So
another nugget of gold.
you add intensity. So your typical learners learned everything on the first go, and then they went to apply those skills. But the children who struggle get a second go, a third go, a fourth go. And possibly next morning they have it.
Oh, excellent. That's another one. Everybody, write it down if you haven't come across it before. As the mother of a struggling reader, who's probably in the 4%, that I think that's excellent. And thank you very much for sharing that. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention before I ask Janine a few questions?
I only want to mention that don't ever give up any one of your struggling readers, and don't ever tell them that, yes, it's being an electrician or being something else is just as good as anything else. Let them dream and support their dreams, because they may very well be academics and not electricians. Not that there's anything wrong with being an electrician. My brother is an electrician, so I'm perfectly happy with electricians in this world. But it's not up to the teachers to tell what the child wants. Your task is to support them and let them keep their hopes up.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So we've got some general, well, I mean, that's very easy to apply in the RE classroom, but now let's just talk about some specific skills that we need in the RE classroom, particularly around the Bible, because, you know, the Bible is a misunderstood text or collection of texts, which is probably the main misunderstanding that you come across with kids. So, Janine, I'm just going to hand over to you. How can teachers effectively approach reading the Bible in the classroom, considering its complexity and significance in religious education? Now, I know that's a big question, and I know you're not a classroom teacher, but what advice would you have for us today?
Well, I think first to understand what kind of, let's call it a book. It's a library of books, but let's say it's a book. We get it delivered as a book. It's a book. And the first aspect of the literacy, this is what kind of book is it? And what's its purpose? So there's a lot of different purposes that the Bible has. I'm a trained historian, so it can function as a historical document, but that's not what it functions as primarily in an RE classroom. RE classroom, it's a source that's used for students to help them to think with and to think about, so that they can understand themselves, their world, understand God, if they're children of faith, understand aspects of belief in God if they're not children of faith, understand their world. So in a sense, my first thing when it comes to literacy is to understand the purpose of the Bible and how it's functioning in RE. And the extension of that is we teach RE, we teach the Bible in religious education to allow children to bring their world into dialogue with the world of the Bible. So there's an encounter there. So for me, the actual reading of the Bible, and by that the decoding of words along the lines that Rauno is talking about, for me that's not the first port of call. For me it is an immersion in the stories of that are in the Bible. So and to do the very things that Rauno is talking about, how do we scaffold students into that? from day one. Most students have no idea who Jesus is in prep and going onwards. Or I'm originally a Melburnian, so I talk about prep. To even start to, and we can't activate prior knowledge because there isn't any prior knowledge there. So to talk about things as simple as this is a really special book that gives us some special stories about a man called Jesus, and we're going to listen to one of those stories now. And then to do exactly what Rauno has talked about, to say this story it's a story, so it's going to have characters. These are the characters. It's going to have and it's a story where a man goes into the desert and he takes a whole lot of people with him. And this is what a desert looks like, and give them imagery. Then because for religious education, it's the encounter that's key, I would always immerse them in a verbal activity around the story, whether it's bibliolog, bibliodrama, that kind of thing first. What's really important in RE is to activate questions that come as a result of that, of that encounter. So wonder why he went there. Why did he go here and not there? Why did he go into the desert? What's in the desert? So to listen to those students and to hear the parts of the story that they get and the parts that they don't get, given that you've already scaffolded them in partly into that, and then use their questions as the place of very explicit teaching afterwards. Some questions are ones that we can answer by the text itself and drill down. Others are really big wonderings that actually are not got to do with the words of the text itself. They've got to do with existential questions that require a very different form of literacy. So on the one hand, there's the very particular literacy around knowing the function of the Bible, knowing the various genres that are in the Bible, knowing how to break them apart in terms of character, plot, knowing really tricky words that emerge in the biblical text, and the teacher having enough time to predict what those tricky words are and to unpack those with children before you go to the story. So there's that element, but also a whole other set of literacy that comes around being able to engage with the text, and it's got more to do with dispositions around being curious about what's in a story, being reflexive and open to where there's parts of a story that you don't agree with, or you don't think, you don't agree with, or you do agree with, or parts that baffle you. So for me, in biblical studies in RE context, we're talking about dispositions as well as talking about the capacity to understand this kind of text and the purpose of it in a confessional space. And I think for primary and secondary school, part of understanding the purpose of that gets done in the practice of engaging with it, encountering it, but also doing the things that we need to do beforehand, because as I said, students don't have that background knowledge. Teachers don't either, by and large. So for teachers, there's a literacy themselves around how do we read the kinds of texts that give us this information so that we can deconstruct some of this language with students. And that's part of my job at ACU, is to teach the literacy around using, for example, biblical commentary, so that teachers have got the capacity to read those texts and understand them as adults, so that they have a capacity then to work with those students and respond to their questions, but also give them the prior knowledge in order to have an initial understanding of what's going on in those texts.
And I'm just working off the cuff here, and Rauno, you might be able to comment on this too. I was just thinking, as a teacher, like I often have to come read biblical commentaries and that. Sorry, I wish I was the font of all knowledge, but no, I do research before I do my teacher's notes or write an article or anything. And that would be a good space to find those words that you would anticipate, like when you're doing that work. And obviously as teachers, you build it up from year to year. It's hard the first year you do it and it gets easier as you go along. But probably when you're in those commentaries, that's probably a good place to make that vocabulary down the side that you want to work on with the students before you jump into telling that story, and then gauging their knowledge and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, often the teacher has to go through the same process that you're going to take the students through. So my job is really to help teachers navigate themselves through this piece of literature and to read commentaries. But I mean, I always say to teachers, read the text for yourself. What don't you understand? What do you understand? What's the genre of this text? What does that look like? And often have to talk about that first so that people can find it in the text, the imprint of that genre. But in a sense, the questions that I might ask a student to think about, particularly in secondary, are sometimes the teacher's questions as well, that the teacher has to investigate first.
We were talking about it a few weeks ago about writing headlines. And one of our colleagues who's very experienced in major newspapers said, oh, make notes, in the columns down the side, because all those little thoughts that you have, that turns into your headline. And I imagine that's a really easy way to incorporate Rauno's techniques into your RE teaching so that you can have that lovely rich experience and encounter once you head into the classroom. I also just wanted to ask you as well, Janine, about the importance of understanding the historical and cultural context when you're reading a Bible text, and how should we be incorporating this into our teaching?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat important, and I think I love your question, Laura, about how do we go about this. I think we need to know our students really, really well, and to know how much of this do they need to know in order to grasp a sense of this story. One of the downsides of relying too much on the historical critical stuff or looking at the historical social context, we know from research, is that it ends up giving students an understanding that this text made sense 2,000 years ago, but it's got nothing to do with my world today. So we have to be very careful. This is why the idea of the purpose of using the Bible in RE has to be really clear in curricula and in schools, in school RE design. But I think there's a whole, first of all, I think what I call it when I'm looking at younger children, what are the tricky words here? That unless they know what it means in its historical context, they cannot understand the story at all. So, or have a very limited understanding. So if I'm reading a story that's about the Samaritans, I need to explain that. If I'm talking about a desert, I need to explain that. If I'm sharing that with children in Sydney. If I'm talking about the temple, I need to explain that. How I explain it and the degree to which I explain it is really dependent on what you know are the learning needs of your students. So you really need to know your students really, really well and constantly listening to their questions, the things that they don't understand, and constantly calibrating what you're going to share with them based on what they know and what they don't know. But there's, particularly with primary school students, I would always be using images. They have very difficult to imagine a world 2,000 years ago. Different place, different time. No, it doesn't matter how well you explain it, it still becomes very, it's difficult for students to visualise that. So there's so many good resources available at the moment. When we're talking about a temple, this is what the temple looked like. We're talking about a desert, this is what the desert looks like. They have to have something, otherwise the story actually makes no sense. I think as students then progress, I mean, I think there's more of the historical critical stuff that you can bring in, and you can start to talk about gender roles, stereotypes, all that kind of way that language works. The extent to which you want to invite students into actually engaging with the actual text, the biblical text, this is where you need to be really clear about why you're using the biblical text. If you're using the biblical text because you want students to identify with an element of the story that you then want to get them to think about and think about their own life about, I would be asking, do they need to be able to read it to do that task? Because the task, or do they need to be able to hear it, or do we give them options for both, depending on the capacity of the student? Because first and foremost, it's not a reading activity; it's an activity around encounter. So I think we have to be really clear about why we're using the Bible in sessions, what kids need in order to access it, and they do need some historical, critical stuff. But I think we have to be really careful that we don't overemphasize that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a lot of, I'm sorry if everybody can hear that. I've got a feedback going on in my headset, but it is interesting when we're situating instruction within a whole school program. Because I know when in one of the schools I worked in, there was a very big focus, and there's to make RE like all the other subjects. And I certainly see it personally as a place where I can sneak in a bit of literacy, because I love to teach kids to read. But also I like to think about them being able to access religious texts and things when they leave school as well. But then again, I teach really big kids. Yeah, so it's an interesting sort of, when you're looking at it, it's a massive task, isn't it?
It is, and I think we have to be careful that the rigor of it comes because it sits in the domain of theology. So it's a much bigger question to say, what does a theologian do? They work with texts. So clearly students, as they get into upper secondary and middle secondary, need to be able to work with those physical texts. And I think all the stuff that Rauno is talking about is absolutely right. You wouldn't do anything differently to that. But I think it has to be grounded in understanding of what the biblical tradition is about. It's about an encounter with the sacred. And that can be done verbally, that can be done in an oral sense, and it also can be done in a written sense as well. So I think we sort of have to be really careful that, I mean, there's amazing artists that have done incredible artwork that are very rudimentary readers, that access this through a very different part of the tradition, which is through an oral aspect. And so I think we have to be really careful here that we're talking about, when we say it has to be like every other discipline, it does, but we can't lose the particularity of the discipline at the same time.
So you're saying don't lose that connection to the theology. I see what you're saying now.
Oh, that's the only way in RE, the biblical,
yes.
Now, if you're teaching the Bible as a history lesson, that's a completely different thing. They have to be able to read it. But when we're talking about it in terms of theology, where we're reading it where we're engaging with it as a sacred text, there's multiple ways to do that, which reading is one.
Absolutely. So can you share with us any strategies? I'll just stop for a minute, actually, because Bronwyn Burke has popped something in here, and it kind of is a strategy. It's going back a couple of questions, but she said reflection at the end of the session, review at the beginning of the next lesson with a break between lessons is helpful, and sharing learning as a community of readers. So that must be some things that were sort of coming to mind as she was listening to the strategies earlier. And thank you very much for sharing that, Bronwyn. Just to sort of wrap up, do you have any practical strategies? You sort of did mention a few, but is there anything you wanted to share with us today?
Oh, I think the stuff that Rauno has talked about is absolutely spot on. I think these texts are so foreign that children just won't access them. The teachers here themselves know that, because they will have trouble accessing them. I'm a biblical scholar. I have trouble accessing them. So but it's really knowing around what are the learning needs of my students? What do they need to know in order to first get an entry point into this text? What are the tricky words? That's the first thing to start off with. What are the really tricky words? And I'm going to have to do some homework and learn about those and talk about those beforehand. And then as students get older, there may be other things. Learn about a genre of a parable. How are you going to talk about that in terms of how you teach genre generally in your literature classes? Use that before you move into a text. But I think the ability for students to be able to question a text, find consolation in a text, be disturbed by a text, all the things that we want children to be able to do and young people, is not just dependent on them being able to read it. They also need to be able to hear it as well. So I would always get them to have an encounter with that text after I'd done that initial scaffolding, maybe orally, and then move into the written text. And then there's a whole lot of other skills that have to come into play that Rauno talked about before. When you sit down with students, they immediately, one of the biggest terrible things that happens in RE curriculum is someone decides, who's written an RE curriculum, that we're going to pluck a story that's halfway through a gospel and get kids to read that and expect them to make meaning out of it with no concept of what has gone on before or after. It's like picking up chapter 20 out of a Harry Potter book and expecting kids to make sense of that. It doesn't work. So I have a lot of sympathy for teachers in RE. I think RE curriculum doesn't serve them well and doesn't serve children well when it comes to biblical studies. I think we make a really complex piece of literature even harder by the way we just take it all apart and expect a 14-year-old to somehow have, masses of literacy to be able to understand one little story in the context of 16 chapters of a book, for example. So I think there are strategies, understanding what happens before a story, what happens after a story, all the stuff that you would do in literacy normally. Who are the characters? What's the plot? All that kind of deconstructing of a text needs to happen as part of you helping students to break down the story. The reading part that Rauno is talking about, the actual looking at morphology of words, I'm cheeky, Rauno. I'm interested to hear what you've got to say. Part of me would even, with some of this stuff, would even be telling kids how to read some of those words because I would be afraid they don't get the meaning. Because the meaning making because of the purpose of the Bible is probably more important than being able to decode the words. But I'm interested to hear what you've got to say about that. And that may be me being the lazy teacher.
Well, when we teach morphology from the generative point of view, that it's a transferable skills to other words that we know they're going to run into. So we don't teach morphology of every word. We teach morphology of words that we know that those roots are very common.
Yeah.
For example, your teachers, but most of you will have no idea what the root morpheme of education is. That root morpheme of education, which is DUC, duck, is not really very generative in terms of you don't need to know it to pick about education. But if you do know it, then you know that education is about leading, guiding in the same way as aqueduct or viaduct guides something else or leads something else. But if we would find that knowing the root morpheme of education would be a very important word for you to know, then that would be one we pick. So in terms of morphology instruction, you want to be very careful on what words you spend time on. And I'm sure there are biblical words that make more sense to do that with and others that don't. The other thing that came to my mind that might be important is that you're working with an authentic text. It's not written for the purpose of children learning to read or learning to write or anything like that. Access to authentic text for younger children is typically easier orally than it is in reading or any other way. So that building that background knowledge to understand the chapter 20 that's probably a multiple years of storytelling early. And then you can start asking them to read themselves. But they have a whole lot of capacity to understand the story structures and things like that orally before they have capacity to understand them or in writing. So that's very important point that Janine made there, is that there is the oral side of accessing the text, and there's also then the reading side of accessing the text, and both can be very, very important.
And it's just such a big topic. It's very hard to do in an hour. I think I'm thinking, right, we need another session on reading comprehension. And now I'm just going, oh, authentic text. You probably saw me making a note there. I think every time I do one of these, I learn something myself. Today I learned a lot myself, which will be turning up in the teacher's notes in coming weeks and months. I'm just, thank you so much. I'm conscious of the fact that we've run out of time. I don't mean to cut anyone off, because there was some excellent, when I was talking about nuggets of gold earlier, there were many more. I just didn't want to slow the session down too much. I'm just going to quickly share screen. Now, I don't need to say too much about this, because I'm actually going to send it to everyone via email. So this is something I've been having a little look at. How do we make this quicker and easier in the classroom when you're trying to manage your time? So I've done an Australian Catholics guide, and it's just based in my own testing, and I've tried to situate it in that research and in that effect of prior knowledge on good and poor readers' memory of text. That's that one that they love to quote in university, about the guy who, the lesson on baseball, give them the terms about baseball and they understand what they're reading a whole lot better. But so I've put together some steps. The main key I've found with using ChatGTP is that if you ask it to randomly generate knowledge, it will not be accurate. It just won't. So I would not do that. However, you can use it if you give it a very clear instruction. And I think, as a journalist, I really do look at audience. And so I very, very clearly specify the audience that I'm writing for. So I will say, create a vocabulary extending activity that focuses on Catholic terms and concepts for a Catholic religious education on faith and music for 12 to 14-year-olds in Australia. It's got to be that boring and that specific. I think one of the things I took away that I have not put in this guide is that I've been structuring my teaching in that, we'd use those reading practices of scanning the text and that sort of thing, and then doing the first read through, doing the second read through, and then doing some knowledge and vocabulary. But I think one of the things I may suggest in some of the future teachers' notes is that you do some vocabulary first. That's one of my takeaways. So I did write this before the session. So I have put it probably in that order, although it might not even look that way. So I've talked about keywords. Be really clear about what you want your students to learn. And I've given some suggestions about that. But the really key takeaway from this is that you need to grab one of our articles. And the reason I say that is not just because we're Australian Catholics magazine. It's because our articles are designed for this sort of use, and they go through several levels of editing. So, first of all, that they may come from the writer. Then myself or Michelle will look at them. Then they go out and they're proofread again, and then they actually go through a parish censor, not a parish censor, a church censor. And so everything in the magazine is checked to make sure that it's theologically accurate. And so you don't really want to use this in a way that it's creating the knowledge for you or doing the research for you. You want to copy and paste your document in after that instruction, and you want to copy and paste it verbatim. If it won't copy and paste, well, drop it into text editor or notes or something and then drop it across. But I find it goes straight across verbatim. And then you can really quickly generate that list of key terms and concepts in that article. And you know that you've already chosen an article or a piece of text that's related to your to your classroom and to what you're teaching. So you've already used your teacher judgment there and made sure that that text is appropriate. So don't get ChatGPT to do the thinking for you. Just get it to do mechanical work for you, and then it can pick out its words. And definitely say Catholic vocabulary and concepts. Don't just say keywords, because it will bring weird, words out. So there's some instructions there on how you can create some vocabulary knowledge questions and things like that very quickly in your classroom. And then I've gone through the traditional way, not the traditional way, so there's only one way, but this is the way I used to use in the classroom that I found really good for me. Every classroom and class is different. But then I've talked about using ChatGPT to support your your slower learners or your kids who are going to be locked out because they're in the inclusive education, how you can use ChatGPT. In that, I mean, I'm not an inclusive education specialist, but in that scenario, I'd suggest using voice to text and to support it as well. And definitely clear instructions for them and lots of support. So I'll send that out. I've sent you, an example. You can go on the website and have a look. I actually published this in term 1 when we did our music edition in summer. This is one of the articles, Marvelous Medieval Music. You can see there's my instruction. There's the article. There we go. It looks like a stream of consciousness. This is what it generated. Some reading comprehension questions, a vocabulary activity. You don't have to do all 3 like I did on this one. This is just for a very short activity. And so that's a matching the word to the definition. And this is a knowledge activity that you can take to back that up. And here's the teacher's notes that it's based on, where you can have a look at it in situ. Obviously, it's not a replacement for a teacher or for human judgment, and you need to proofread carefully. But it is something you may like to experiment with in the classroom, especially if you're learning this stuff for the first time and the time is getting on top of you. Now, I realise we're starting to we're 5 minutes over time. So I'm going to hand back to Michael, if that's okay, to close the session.
Might
Is
just
Michael
need to unshare, Laura. That's fine.
Oh no! I want everyone to look at my document, which I raced through very quickly. And thank you again to Janine and Rauno. I always feel in these short sessions that we just don't do enough justice to the knowledge, but we'd love to have you back again if you would have us.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rauno and Janine. I'll echo Laura's words there. I've learned a lot, and this is not my area of expertise, but I found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you.